Hi everyone and welcome back to Scholastically Natalie. I just am going to jump right into the series that I mentioned last video called Let's Read. I wanted to start with H.P. Lovecraft as we did read his introduction last video. It feels like yesterday. This one might have some breaks in it since it is considerably longer than just 2 pages. I have my water on standby. So, first of all, this is from the same anthology I mentioned last time, The Great Tales of Horror. Commentary is by me, of course, Scholastically Natalie. And we're starting with the Call of Cthulhu and Part 1, The Horror in Clay. So, the interesting part of this anthology, I guess you could say, is that at the beginning of each of these separate stories, it gives like a short background on where the story is from or when it was published, which is honestly pretty interesting. It makes interior literary nerd Natalie very happy. So, we're gonna look at the excerpts and Sorry, I should preface this. So we have the little description of when this story was published, and then there's usually a little quote of some sort of excerpt that's supposed to make you more nervous about reading the story ahead. So both of those come before the actual title in this. So, this is The Call of Cthulhu. So, it was found among the papers of the late Francis Wayland Thurston of Boston. This momentous story, which introduced the Erasts mythology that came to be called the Cthulhu mythos, was written in the summer of 1926. Lovecraft had come up with a plot synopsis as early as August 1925, but could not write the story until he returned to Providence. Several literary influences have been put forth, ranging from Guy de Maupassant's The Horla to A. Merritt's The Moon Pool to theosophical writings, but Lovecraft has synthesized these multifarious sources into something entirely new. It was initially rejected by Weird Tales and also by the obscure pulp magazine Mystery Stories, but upon Donald Waindray's suggestion, Lovecraft resubmitted it to Weird Tales, where it appeared in the February 1928 issue. And I'd just like to preface this with my opinion. Honestly, I found the first part kind of like slow going in this story. So I think it's kind of interesting just by the 1926 standards, they just like wouldn't even accept it. I found that kind of humorous. Okay, so here's the quote from one of the fake people. Of such great powers or beings, there may be conceivably a survival of a hugely remote period when consciousness was manifested perhaps in shapes and forms long since withdrawn before the tide of advancing humanity, forms of which poetry and legend alone have caught a flying memory and called them gods, monsters, mythical beings of all sorts and kinds. Algernon Blackwood. And now we have part 1, The Horror in Clay. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but someday the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality, and of our frightened position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. I love this quote. It really captures like Lovecraft's entire perspective on horror. It's just that we are tiny beings floating on this tiny island, and we just are so unaware of what surrounds us and what lies beyond. I think Lovecraft was I think he's really, really good at tapping into the human fear of the unknown. Because I feel like a lot of horror stories do that, but then we always have to explain what the monsters are and where they come from. I don't remember who said this. It was either, I want to say it was Foundflix or Mr. Gigi. I really like watching both of their reviews. But they said that with the new The Nun movie, Vlak was so much less scary because we knew who she was and why she was there. And therefore, we weren't frightened of her. And I think that is such a great point, is that you are always far more scared when your imagination runs wild. And I think that's something that a lot of, like, I know that I was really not able to grasp, like, even as a freshman in college when I was taking a creative writing course. I distinctly remember somebody leaving just kind of like this open gap where they just like implied a torture of a character, and I was kind of like, you might as well just do it. Like, just show us. And while I still kind of hold to that same position, I do feel that you can leave that sort of thing as kind of a mystery, because the human brain is terrifying. Okay, I'll continue. Theosophists have guessed at the awesome grandeur of the cosmic cycle wherein our world and human race form transient incidents. They have hinted at strange survivals in terms which would freeze the blood if not masked by a bland optimism. But it is not from them that there came the single glimpse of forbidden aeons which chills me when I think of it and maddens me when I dream of it. That glimpse, like all dread glimpses of truth, flashed out from an accidental piecing together of separated things, in this case an old newspaper item and the notes of a dead professor. I hope that no one will accomplish this piecing out. Certainly if I live, I shall never knowingly supply a link in so hideous a chain. I think that the professor, too, intended to keep silent regarding the part he knew, and that he would have destroyed his notes had not sudden death seized him. Okay, I'm pausing again, but I have found myself so often stuck with, like, first writers' attempts at writing, and it's always first person point of view, and so often I'm just like, it is such a crutch, because if you just say you're feeling like it, you don't have to describe it, you don't have to provide a thought process, you can just say I'm sad, and the reader has to fill in the gaps, wherein if you describe the feeling of it, it hits so much harder. And I feel like Lovecraft writes in like such a weirdly subdued but frightened tone that he kind of captures the first person, how it could be used in horror, because he's writing it as like a reflection and like a look back on things that he regrets seeing. And I find it very interesting, because usually I do not like first person perspective, but here Lovecraft makes it work. Okay. My knowledge of the thing began in the winter of 1926 through 27 with the death of my grand-uncle George Gamel Angel, Professor Emeritus of Semitic Languages in Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island. Professor Angel was widely known as an authority on ancient inscriptions and had frequently been resorted to by the heads of prominent museums so that his passing at the age of 92 might be recalled by many. Locally, interest was intensified by the obscurity of the cause of death. The professor had been stricken whilst returning from the Newport boat, falling suddenly, as witnesses said, after having been jostled by a nautical-looking Negro who had come from one of the queer dark courts on the precipitous hillside which formed a shortcut from the waterfront to the deceased's home in William Street. Physicians were unable to find any visible disorder, but concluded after perplexed debate that some obscure lesion of the heart, induced by the brisk ascent of so steep a hill by so elderly a man, was responsible for the end. At the time I saw no reason to dissent from this dictum, but latterly I am inclined to wonder, and more than wonder. So, I constantly forget that Lovecraft was indeed writing far, far before we got civil rights movements. So, as a preface, I will be doing my best not to say any slurs. So, hopefully this will be the last time I have to use the N-word of any kind, because even reading that just now made me slightly uncomfortable. So from then I will endeavor to replace it with words such as fellow or African American. I will figure it out. Maybe I'll just say person of color or POC and just substitute that for any and all potentially slanderous descriptions. I apologize in advance if anything sounds weird because of it. Having read some of these stories, I honestly don't see many of those descriptions yet, at least, and I think Lovecraft felt himself above using such terms because he was an academic. Okay, I'm going to continue on. As my granduncle's heir and executor, for he died a childless widower, I was expected to go over his papers with some thoroughness, and for that purpose moved his entire set of files and boxes to my quarters in Boston. Much of the material which I correlated will be later published by the American Archaeological Society, but there was one box which I found exceedingly puzzling, and which I felt much averse from shewing to other eyes. It had been locked, and I did not find the key till it occurred to me to examine the personal ring which the professor always carried in his pocket. Then indeed I succeeded in opening it, but when I did so seemed only to be confronted by a greater and more closely locked barrier. For what could be the meaning of the queer clay bas-relief and the disjointed jottings, ramblings, and cuttings which I found? Had my uncle in his latter years become credulous of the most superficial impostures? I resolved to search out the eccentric sculptor responsible for this apparent disturbance of an old man's peace of mind. We'll pause because, again, Lovecraft has a very big vocabulary. I apologize if I stumble on a lot of words. Also because I tend to speak faster than I breathe. So, well, okay, so basically, he opened the box that his uncle had and found a clay sculpture. Just in case you missed that with all of the weird word usage. He used the term queer clay bas-relief as in a strange sculpture. Okay, the bas-relief was a rough rectangle less than an inch thick and about 5 by 6 inches in area, obviously of modern origin. Its designs, however, were far from modern in atmosphere and suggestion, for although the vagaries of cubism and futurism are many and wild, they do not often reproduce that cryptic regularity which lurks in prehistoric writing. In writing of some kind, the bulk of these designs certainly seem to be, though my memory, despite much familiarity with the papers and collections of my uncle, failed in any way to identify this particular species or even to hint at its remotest affiliations. Above these apparent hieroglyphics was a figure of evidently pictorial intent, though its impressionist execution forbade a very clear image of its nature. It seemed to be a sort of monster, or symbol representing a monster, of a form which only a diseased fancy could conceive. If I say that my somewhat extravagant imagination yields simultaneous pictures of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature, I shall not be unfaithful to the spirit of the thing. A pulpy, tentacled head surmounted a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings, but it was the general outline of the whole which made it most shockingly frightful. Behind the figure was a vague suggestion of a cyclopean architectural background. The writing accompanying this oddity was, aside from a stack of press cuttings, in Professor Angel's most recent hand, and made no pretense to literary style. What seemed to be the main document was headed Cthulhu Cult, in characters painstakingly printed to avoid the erroneous reading of a word so unheard of. The manuscript was divided into 2 sections, the first of which was headed 1925, Dream and Dream Work of H.A. Wilcox, 7 Thomas Street, Providence, Rhode Island, and the second, Narrative of Inspector John R. LeGrasse, 121 Bienville Street, New Orleans, Louisiana, at 1908 AAS meeting, notes on same, and Professor Webb's account. The other manuscript papers were all brief notes, some of them accounts of the queer dreams of different persons, some of them citations from theosophical books and magazines, notably W. Scott Ellison's Atlantis and the Lost Lemuria, and the rest comments on long-surviving secret societies and hidden cults with references to passages in such mythological and anthropological source books as Fraser's Golden Bough and Miss Murray's Witch Cult in Western Europe. The cuttings largely alluded to outre, mental illnesses, and outbreaks of group folly or mania in the spring of 1925. So, if we remember, one of the main effects of Cthulhu, it is resounding insanity and madness. That's why the Call of Cthulhu has that mechanic in its gameplay. The first half of the principal manuscript told a very peculiar tale. It appears that on March 1st, 1925, a thin, dark young man of neurotic and excited aspect had called upon Professor Angel bearing the singular clay bas-relief, which was then exceedingly damp and fresh. His card bore the name of Henry Anthony Wilcox, and my uncle had recognized him as the youngest son of an excellent family slightly known to him, who had latterly been studying sculpture at the Rhode Island School of Design and living alone at the Fleur-de-Lis building near that institution. Wilcox was a precocious youth of known genius but great eccentricity, and had from childhood excited attention through the strange stories and odd dreams he was in the habit of relating. He called himself psychically hypersensitive, but the staid folk of the ancient commercial city dismissed him as merely queer. Never mingling much with his kind, he had dropped gradually from social visibility and was now known only to a small group of aesthetes from other towns. Even the Providence Art Club, anxious to preserve its conservatism, had found him quite hopeless. So, another side note, because I realize I'm using the word queer a lot. This isn't a slur. Before we became more modern. This was just another word for strange. I feel like I'm unnecessarily clarifying this, but I just want to cover all my bases. Again, remember, previous education major, I like to explain things. On the occasion of the visit ran the professor's manuscript, the sculptor abruptly asked for the benefit of his host's archaeological knowledge in identifying the hieroglyphs on the bas-relief. He spoke in a dreamy, stilted manner which suggested pose and alienated sympathy, and my uncle shewed some sharpness in replying, for the conspicuous freshness of the tablet implied kinship with anything but archaeology. Young Wilcox's rejoinder, which impressed my uncle enough to make him recall and record it verbatim, was of a fantastically poetic cast which must have typified his whole conversation, and which I have since found highly characteristic of him. He said, "It is new indeed, for I made it last night in a dream of strange cities, and dreams are older than brooding Tyre or the contemplative Sphinx or garden-girdled Babylon." So, side note again, because side notes are my passion. I definitely marked this because this was, again, such a fun couple of sentences. So, first off, this is great characterization. This is like the first piece of dialogue in 4 pages. It's kind of insane, honestly. But secondly, it shows like how archaic this man is speaking, like how he's been affected. Because even in this book, that's really not typically how people talk. I will notice because you are not seeing the pages here, but I'm probably going to note that oftentimes Lovecraft doesn't have his characters talk, which makes you as the reader feel even more detached from them because you don't get to hear their speech patterns or try to figure out like how they think from how they're speaking. Everything has to be relayed to you through the first person narrator. And then secondly, we have some great allusions. I have no idea what Tyre or Tyr is. I'm sorry if I'm saying it incorrectly. I'm actually really bad at pronouncing things. But Sphinx, we all, hopefully, know is in Egypt. It was a giant monument built by the pharaohs that people oftentimes attribute to, along with the pyramids, being influenced by aliens, because theoretically, according to us, it is impossible for them to have built it because they didn't have the technology. On the other hand, they did have thousands upon thousands of slaves that they didn't care if they lived or died to create such monuments, so that might weigh out modern machinery. And then, of course, we have garden-girdled Babylon, which I haven't brushed up in my religion in a while. I do remember got knocked down by God at some point. I'm pretty sure they're worshipping false idols because that's pretty much what everybody does. But it was a very nice city, pretty much in the middle of a desert, which was just rich with water and plant life. It would not be dissimilar from the Garden of Eden in terms of, like, mythology. Okay. It was then that he began that rambling tale which suddenly played upon a sleeping memory and won the fevered interest of my uncle. There had been a slight earthquake tremor the night before, the most considerable felt in New England for some years, and Wilcox's imagination had been keenly affected. Upon retiring, he had an unprecedented dream of great cyclopean cities of Titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, all dripping with green ooze and sinister with latent horror. Hieroglyphs had covered the walls and pillars, and from some undetermined point below had come a voice that was not a voice, a chaotic sensation which only fancy could transmute into sound, but which he attempted to render by the almost unpronounceable jumble of letters, Cthulhu Fhtagn. I don't know why I didn't underline that turn of phrase. I love that entire sentence leading up to that. I feel like it's such great description of something trying to communicate you that doesn't know your language and that you can never comprehend. I don't know. I really like how Lovecraft writes. This verbal jumble was the key to the recollection which excited and disturbed Professor Angell. He questioned the sculptor with scientific minuteness, and studied with almost frantic intensity the bas-relief on which the youth had found himself working, chilled and clad only in his night-clothes, when waking had stolen bewilderingly over him. My uncle blamed his old age, Wilcox afterward said, for his slowness in recognizing both hieroglyphs and pictorial design. Many of his questions seemed highly out of place to his visitor, especially those which tried to connect the latter with strange cults or societies, and Wilcox could not understand the repeated promises of silence which he was offered in exchange for an admission of membership in some widespread mythical or paganly religious body. When Professor Angel became convinced that the sculptor was indeed ignorant of any cult or system of cryptic lore, he besieged his visitor with demands for future reports of dreams. This bore regular fruit, for after the first interview, the manuscript records daily calls of the young man, during which he related startling fragments of nocturnal imagery whose burden was always some terrible cyclopean vista of dark and dripping stone, with a subterranean voice or intelligence shouting monotonously, in enigmatical sense impacts uninscribable save as gibberish. The two sounds most frequently repeated are those rendered by the letters Cthulhu and Relaya. Relaya? Again, weird spelling. We're pausing to take a drink. Okay, we are back. On March 23rd, the manuscript continued. Wilcox failed to appear, and inquiries at his quarters revealed he had been stricken with an obscure sort of fever and taken to the home of his family in Waterman Street. He had cried out in the night, arousing several other artists in the building, and had manifested since then only alternations of unconsciousness and delirium. My uncle at once telephoned the family, and from that time forward kept close watch of the case, calling often at the Thayer Street office of Dr. Toby, whom he learned to be in charge. The youth's febrile mind, apparently, was dwelling on strange things, and the doctor shuddered now and then as he spoke of them. They included not only a repetition of what he had formerly dreamed, but touched wildly on a gigantic thing, miles high, which walked or lumbered about. He at no time fully described this object, but occasional frantic words, as repeated by Dr. Toby, convinced the professor that it must be identical with the nameless monstrosity he had sought to depict in his dream sculpture. Reference to this object, the doctor added, was invariably a prelude to the young man's subsidence into lethargy. His temperature, oddly enough, was not greatly above normal, but his whole condition was otherwise such as to suggest true fever rather than mental disorder. On April 2nd, at about 3 p.m., every trace of Wilcox's malady suddenly ceased. He sat upright in bed, astonished to find himself at home and completely ignorant of what had happened in dream or reality since the night of March 22nd. Pronounced well by his physician, he returned to his quarters in 3 days, but to Professor Angel he was of no further assistance. All traces of strange dreaming had vanished with his recovery, and my uncle kept no record of his night thoughts after a week of pointless and irrelevant accounts of thoroughly usual visions. Here the first part of the manuscript ended, but references to certain of the scattered notes gave me much material for thought, so much, in fact, that only the ingrained skepticism then forming my philosophy can account for my continued distress of the artist. The notes in question were those descriptive of the dreams of various persons covering the same person, as that in which young Wilcox had his strange visitations. My uncle, it seems, had quickly instituted a prodigiously far-flung body of inquiries amongst nearly all the friends whom he could question without impertinence, asking for nightly reports of their dreams and the dates of any notable visions for some time past. The reception of his request seems to have been varied, but he must, at the very least, have received more responses than any ordinary man could have handled without a secretary. The original correspondence was not preserved, but his notes formed a thorough and really significant digest. Average people in society and business, New England's traditional salt of the earth, gave an almost completely negative result, though scattered cases of uneasy but formless nocturnal impressions appear here and there, always between March 23rd and April 2nd, the period of young Wilcox's delirium. Scientific men were little more affected, though 4 cases of vague descriptions suggest fugitive glimpses of strange landscapes, and in one case there is mentioned a dread of something abnormal. It was from the artists and poets that the pertinent answers came, and I know that panic would have broken loose had they been able to compare notes. As it was, lacking their original letters, I half suspected the compiler of having asked leading questions, or of having edited the correspondence in corroboration of what he had latently resolved to see. That is why I continued to feel that Wilcox, somehow cognizant of the old data which my uncle had possessed, had been imposing on the veteran scientist. These responses from estates told a disturbing tale. From February 28th to April 2nd, a large proportion of them had dreamed very bizarre things, the intensity of the dreams being immeasurably the stronger during the period of the sculptor's delirium. Over a fourth of those who reported anything reported scenes and half-sounds not unlike those which Wilcox had described, and some of the dreamers confessed acute fear of the gigantic nameless thing visible toward the last. One case, which the note describes with emphasis, was very sad. The subject, a widely known architect with leanings toward theosophy and occultism, went violently insane on the date of young Wilcox's seizure, and expired several months later after incessant screamings to be saved from some escaped denizen of hell. Had my uncle referred to these cases by name instead of merely by number, I would have attempted some corroboration and personal investigation. But as it was, I succeeded in tracing down only a few. All of these, however, bore out the notes in full. I have often wondered if all the objects of the professor's questioning felt as puzzled as did this fraction. It is well that no explanation shall ever reach them. The press cuttings, as I have intimated, touched on cases of panic, mania, and eccentricity during the given period. Professor Angell must have employed a cutting bureau, for the numbers of extracts was tremendous, and the sources scattered throughout the globe. Here was a nocturnal suicide in London, where a lone sleeper had leapt from a window after a shocking cry. Here likewise a rambling letter to the editor of a paper in South America, where a fanatic deduces a dire future from visions he has seen. A dispatch from California describes a theosophist colony as donning white robes en masse for some glorious fulfillment which never arrives, whilst items from India speak guardedly of serious native unrest toward the end of March. Voodoo orgies multiply in Haiti, and African outposts report ominous mutterings. American officers in the Philippines find certain tribes bothersome about this time, and New York policemen are mobbed by hysterical Levantines on the night of March 22nd through 23rd. The west of Ireland, too, is full of wild rumor and legendary, and a fantastic painter named Ardois Bonnet hangs a blasphemous dream landscape in the Paris Spring Salon of 1926. And so numerous are the recorded troubles in insane asylums that only a miracle can have stopped the medical fraternity from noting strange parallelisms and drawing mystified conclusions. A weird bunch of cuttings, all told, and I can at this date scarcely envisage the callous rationalism with which I set them aside, but I was then convinced that young Wilcox had known of the older matters mentioned by the professor. So, that is the end of part 1. Again, this is a little bit of a slow story, but it's so good with, like, the creeping dread. It's just, there's something going on, and it's just terrifying. Like, it reminds me of, like, superhero movies, where it's just, oh, this thing's only attacking where we are? How convenient. Like, it just, it really reminds me a lot of, like, the Avengers, with, how conveniently the aliens only opened a portal over, like, New York. Where it's like, well, how'd you know all the Avengers would be there? And, like, this is on such a more global scale. Like, it's that kind of just far-flung dread that just, like, all these unconnected at first, but as you look, they're clearly all caused by something moving around. So, to recap, Professor dies, nephew goes in, finds a horrifying clay sculpture made by an artist who apparently went pretty much completely insane for, like, almost a full week, ranting about, like, underground cities and terrifying monsters that this dead professor had then found further accounts of other people who were artists or otherwise mentally ill, suffering similar visions in that same time span. And all reacting in some way, shape, or form to it. Where, by the end of this, nephew is still convinced that this is all, of course, just a crazy old man seeing conspiracies. So, that is the first part of the Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft. I hope you have at least enjoyed somewhat. Please let me know if you think I've been explaining too much or too little. I do go very much nerd crazy for books, and again, I have been perhaps trained a little bit too well in explaining things to people. I don't want to assume that you know things that you might not know, though, so I always feel like it's better to explain a little bit too much than explain too little, because I do want everybody to enjoy these beautiful books that I have to offer. Anyways, hopefully I will be able to record part 2 soon, and we can see what you think of it then. Thanks for watching. Scholastically Natalie, out.